I ranked every QB in Lions history. The only requirements are 1, they had to play in the Super Bowl era, so sorry but there's no Bobby Lane. 2, they had to be listed as a QB while playing for the Lions. 3, they had to play in at least one official NFL game. And finally, I'm only ranking them based on how they played for the Lions. Now there's only been 58 quarterbacks to play for the Lions, which is a decent amount less than the 3 other teams I've done, but as you may see, aside from a couple players, their QB history has really been bad. Anyways, let's get into it. In 58th and last place is Sam Wyche. Wyche appeared in 14 games and threw 1 pass, and that 1 pass was an interception. But that's not even unique, because above him at 57 is Matt Blunden, who also threw 1 pass which was an interception. At 56 and 55 are Jerry Goldstein and Tom Myers. Both had 16 total yards and 2 interceptions each. Then at 54 is IU legend Nate Sudfeld, and he did nothing but get sacked in his Lions career. At 53 is Kyle Allen, who actually played for the Lions last year, and only threw 2 passes which were both incomplete. Then at 52 through 49 is Greg Barton, Brendan Fulmar, Ty Detmer, and Teddy Bridgewater, who all only need the ball. Alright, this is me from the future, and I actually made a mistake because Ty Detmer was on the Lions 2 different times, and so the second time he only needed the ball, but the first time he started a few games, including one where he threw an NFL record 7 interceptions in that game. So honestly, I don't feel that bad about him being this low down. At 48 is Mike Maturek. He appeared in 4 games and threw 14 of 43 for 193 yards and 0 touchdowns to 6 picks. Then at 47 is Jake Rudock. The former Iowa and Michigan QB only appeared in 3 games in his career, and he had 24 yards and an interception. And apparently his nickname is Dad, so that's something, I guess. At 46 is Bill Capelman, who threw for 33 yards and a pick. Then at 45 is Drew Henson. Now Henson is the most recent person to officially play in the MLB and NFL. Originally he was in QB battles with Tom Brady at Michigan, but he went on to play in the MLB and actually play for the Yankees. And then after that he went to the Cowboys and bounced around practice squads and spring football leagues before throwing for 20 yards on the Lions in 2008. At 44 is Jack Kincannon, who only passed for 30 yards as a Lion. And then at 43 is actually Josh McCown. And as you might know, McCown was actually more of a receiver while he was on the Lions. Yes, in McCown's 2 games as a Lion, he had 0 passing yards and 15 receiving yards. And that doesn't even include his best highlight where he absolutely cooked this defender, but he's playing against the Tom Brady Patriots, so it's an offensive pass interference. But yeah, this stint was legendary. At 42 is Matt Castle. Castle was obviously solid earlier in his career, but he only appeared in 2 games for the Lions and passed for 59 yards and a pick. At 41 is Hendon Hooker. This dude was him at Tennessee, but so far he's only appeared in 3 NFL games, all for the Lions, and had 62 total yards. At 40 is John Witkowski, who actually started a game for the Lions where they obviously lost, and he appeared in 4 other games and had a total of 210 yards. At 39 is JT O'Sullivan, who had 148 yards and 1 touchdown to 2 picks. And then at 38 is Chase Daniel, who's pretty similar. He had 264 yards, but also had 1 touchdown to 2 picks. And then at 37 is Scott Hunter, who appeared in 13 games and had over 300 yards and 1 touchdown to 1 pick. At 36 is Stoney Case, who actually started a game where the Lions won, beating the Saints 14-10. But in the rest of his time for the Lions, Case threw 1 touchdown to 4 interceptions. At 35 is Tim Boyle. This might be the highest you'll ever see this dude get ranked in one of these lists, because he is awful. He only appeared in 5 games and started 3 of them, going 0-3 in his starts. His first start came against the Browns where he threw for 80 yards and 2 picks. Then the next week he played mediocre but threw a game-losing interception. And in his final start he threw 262 yards and 2 touchdowns, but also threw 3 interceptions. And he was no longer on the Lions after that. At 34 is David Blau, the new offensive coordinator for the Commanders. Blau started 5 games in 2019, where the Lions lost all 5, and Blau had just under 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns to 6 picks. He only made a couple more garbage time appearances after this, before going to the Cardinals and then retiring and becoming an offensive coordinator. At 33 is Dante Culpepper. Now Culpepper had the fall off of doom while playing for the Lions, being one of the 3 starting quarterbacks in the 0-16 2008 season, and going 0-10 as a starter, throwing 7 touchdowns to 12 picks as a Detroit Lion. At 32 is Jeff Garcia, another guy who had a fall off. After his Browns days, Garcia went to the Lions and had the worst season of his career, going 1-4 as a starter and throwing 3 touchdowns to 6 picks. At 31 is Jeff Driscoll. Driscoll had his ups and downs on the Lions. I mean, the Lions did lose in all 3 of his starts, but he individually did solid in his first 2 games and close losses, but he played awful against Washington and got hurt. At 30 is Frank Reich. Reich went 0-2 in his starts for the Lions and threw 5 touchdowns to 6 picks. At 29 is Jeff Comlow, and this dude was miserable as a starter, going 2-14 and throwing 12 touchdowns to 27 picks. Then at 28 is Dan Orlovsky. Now you might be saying, this dude should be last place, he sucked. Okay, yeah, Orlovsky was the main starter for the Lions when they went 0-16, but out of the 3 starters that season, he was the best one, and he threw 8 touchdowns to 8 picks, which could honestly be worse. And I honestly think a lot of people draw their conclusions on Orlovsky after that one safety play. At 27 is Rusty Hilger. He went 3-6 as a starter and threw 7 touchdowns to 12 picks. At 26 is Todd Hans. Hans appeared during the 1987 strike and went 1-2 as a starter and threw 5 touchdowns to 5 picks. At 25 is Drew Stanton. Stanton was a second-round pick by the Lions, but he never really got to play much. His first throw ever was actually a touchdown, but he only ended up throwing 4 more touchdowns in his Lions career, ending with 5 touchdowns to 9 picks and going 2-2 as a starter. At 24 is Mike McMahon. Now, Jim McMahon had a brother named Mike McMahon, but that is not this dude. This dude is completely unrelated, and he went 1-6 as a starter and threw 10 touchdowns to 13 picks. At 23 is Joe Ferguson. Ferguson was solid earlier in his career, but he was kind of washed when he was on the Lions, throwing only 9 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. Then at 22 is Andre Ware. The former Heisman was the 7th overall pick and was very disappointing as he barely played. He only started 6 games where he went 3-3 as a starter and threw 5 touchdowns to 8 picks, and that wrapped up his entire NFL career. At 21 is Joe Reed. Reed went 6-6 as a starter and threw 14 touchdowns to 18 picks. Then at 20 is Don Majkowski. His final days in his career were on Detroit, and he was solid, I guess. He was mostly a backup, but went 1-1 as a starter and threw 4 touchdowns to 3 picks. At 19 is Carl Sweeten. Sweeten went 6-8-2 as a starter and only threw 14 touchdowns to 25 picks. Then at 18 is a similar player in Chuck Long. Chuck went 4-17 as a starter, including one season where he led the league in picks. Then at 17 is Bob Gagliano. In 1989, Gagliano was nicknamed the Goose, and he helped lead the Lions to some success, going 6-5 as a starter, but he never played too great individually. At 16 is Gus Frerotte. After his time in Washington, Frerotte had some underwhelming time in Detroit, where he went 2-4 as a starter and threw 9 touchdowns to 7 picks. And he even started in the wildcard playoff game, but he kind of sold, throwing 1 touchdown to 2 picks as the Lions went on to lose. Then at 15 is John Kitna. Kitna played 3 seasons in Detroit where he played like usual, throwing for a butt ton of yards, having over 4,000 in his first 2 seasons, but he also threw more picks than touchdowns both of these seasons. And his final season came in the 2008 0-16 season, and he did about as bad as you'd expect, having a QBR of 19.5. Then at 14 is Joey Harrington. Now I know what you might be thinking, Joey Harrington sucked, and yes, that's pretty true, but I promise you everyone under him somehow sucks more. Harrington was very disappointing after being the 3rd overall pick, as he only went 18-37 as a starter. Youch. His best season came in 2004 where he had just over 3,000 yards and threw 19 touchdowns to 12 picks, but every other season besides that, he threw more interceptions than touchdowns, and in 2003 he led the league in picks. At 13 is Shaun Hill. Hill was on the Lions from 2010 to 2013, and his first appearance ever actually was in the Calvin Johnson game, where it looked like he threw a game-winning touchdown but a dumb ruling overturned it. Anyways, Hill individually played solid on the Lions, but the Lions were only 3-7 while he was starting. At 12 is Milt Plum. Plum was a longtime starter for the Lions in the 1960s. Anyways, he had 1 really good season for the Lions, but the rest he was absolutely terrible, including 1963 where he threw 2 touchdowns to 12 picks, and 1965 where he led the league in interceptions. At 11 is Rodney Peete. Now RP was a 6th round pick by the Lions, but actually got to play a decent amount, and overall he was mediocre. He had some alright seasons, but also some atrocious seasons. And weirdly, his rushing stats followed the same trend, as sometimes he was a solid rusher and sometimes he was terrible. And now we're into the top 10 QBs in Lions history. And at 10 is Charlie Batch. Now Batch was a longtime backup for the Steelers, but he actually started his career on the Lions and started for about 4 seasons. His first 2 seasons were actually really solid. He threw 24 touchdowns with 13 picks combined in these 2 seasons. However, after this he crashed and burned, as 2 seasons after that, the Lions went 0-9 with him as a starter. At 9 is Eric Hipple, and there was actually not one season where he threw more touchdowns than picks, but the Lions could have been worse during that span, I guess, as Hipple went 28-29 as a starter. Alright, at 8 is Dave Krieg, and he's probably the first person on this list that I would say was actually good. He wasn't on the Lions for long, but he was pretty solid. He went 5-2 as a starter and threw 14 touchdowns to 3 picks, and even helped the Lions make the playoffs where they narrowly lost to the Packers. Then at 7 is Scott Mitchell. Now Mitchell was very mid besides the 1995 season where he threw 32 touchdowns to 12 picks, and he led the Lions to the playoffs that year. Now he absolutely shit the bed in the playoffs, still though that was the best season in franchise history up until that point. At 6 is Bill Munson. Munson was an on and off again starter, having a record of 24-21-3 and throwing 56 touchdowns to 42 picks. Alright, now we're into the top 5, and at 5 is Eric Kramer. In Kramer's first season on the Lions, he threw 11 touchdowns to 8 picks and went 6-2 in his starts, and he actually led the Lions to the playoffs. His biggest accomplishment was he actually won a playoff game. The Lions destroyed the Cowboys, but then they proceeded to get destroyed themselves the next game. Still though, winning a playoff game for the Lions gets you as much respect from me as winning a Super Bowl. Then at 4 is Gary Danielson. He wrote a letter to every NFL team to give him a chance, and the Lions were the only ones to do so. He was a longtime starter and ended up throwing for just under 12,000 yards, but the Lions were not too great during this time. At 3 is Greg Landry. Now Landry started 84 games and went 40-41-3, and he threw for over 12,000 yards, including 1971, where he made a Pro Bowl and finished top 10 in MVP voting. But I don't think he's better than number 2, and that's Jared Goff. Now I'm not exactly sure what Lions fans think of Goff right now after last season. I mean, he wasn't awful, but the team disappointed and he had some bad performances in must-win games. I mean, especially losing against Max Brosmer, that's pretty rough. But I think overall they like him. In Goff's first season, the team was really bad, but it wasn't really his fault. But then the Lions absolutely turned their franchise around, becoming playoff contenders, and Goff's best season was probably in 2023, where he threw 30 touchdowns to 12 picks, but more importantly, he helped the Lions to 2 playoff wins, meaning that Goff is the all-time leader in Lions history for playoff wins, as Eric Kramer is the only other starter to have a win as a Lion. So it's kind of hard not to put Goff 2 because of that success, but I think number 1 is obvious. The one, the only, Matthew Stafford. Now, he never had a playoff win on the Lions. I mean, they did get kind of screwed against the Cowboys, but still, this dude has every major accomplishment in Lions history, and Stafford throwing a game-winning touchdown with a dislocated shoulder. Alright, that's the video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed. Luho out.